Okay, hello. Welcome and thanks to all who have gathered with us online today. I am Joan Du, Dean of Daniel's Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design. Today, I'm delighted to welcome you to the book talk of Landscape Citizenships. First, I would like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron, Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Islands, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. This is a particular, I think, relevant and important book in relationship to the acknowledgement of the land that we're working in. The book Landscape Citizenships, edited by Tim Waterman, Jane Wolfe, and Ed Wall, challenges assumptions that landscape and citizenship belong in different intellectual arenas. It's 14 essays by authors from around the world question and counter the narrowly defined relationships among people, places, and states. Together, the collection examine and illuminate conditions where people belong to a place and to other people connected to that place in ways that transcend and refute the existing structures of political belonging. I believe this is a very relevant and pertinent topic for us to be discussing today in Toronto, in Canada, and in the world today, to really start examining from a research perspective, from a knowledge production perspective, for us to be able to contribute to this important topic that is of both academic and public concern. So I am very, very glad for Daniel's faculty to be hosting this particular book talk. And I would like to welcome our own Professor Jane Wolfe to introduce the event and the guest speakers. Jane, you may want to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Joan. We're really thrilled and honored to be here. Today's program is a conversation about what it means to belong to a place, and also to belong to other people who care about that same place. And our conversation is supported and surrounded by other conversations that I'd like to acknowledge. The national conversations we're having as Canadians that address our responsibilities as treaty people. And it's important to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and by the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I'd like to also acknowledge the conversations I've had the pleasure of having with Ed, Tim, and the book's contributors in the several years since we conceived this project, with our research assistants, Joshua Bauman and Amelia Harton, whose work to bring the final manuscript together was an essential part of making the book a reality. The conversations I've had with Dean Du, Jason Yen, Tim Clark, and Mimi Brody about this event in relation to the fall program series, with James Bird and Ange Loft about what landscape citizenships might mean for us here and now in the book's first chapter, which is called Landscape Citizenships, A Conversation Among Treaty People. And also thanks to all of you for joining us today. Just a word about the format of our conversation. Over the next hour, Tim, Ed, and I have asked three of the book's contributors, all really wonderful emerging scholars, to ask each other about their essays. And then we've also asked them to ask us editors anything they want. And after that, we'll open it up to the audience, and I will keep time. So first, who are we? All of us. Ed Wall is the academic lead of landscape architecture and urbanism and co-director of the Advanced Urban Research Group at the University of Greenwich in London. Tim Waterman is an associate professor of landscape theory at the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College London. Anna Antonova is director of environmental humanities development at the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society. James Bird is a knowledge keeper from the Newa Nation and Dene Nation and a Master of Architecture student at the Daniels faculty. And Danika Cooper is Assistant Professor of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning at the University of California, Berkeley. And what we'll do to start is to have Ed and Tim each say a few words about the book, and then it's the turn of Anna, James, and Danika. So Ed.
Okay, thank you very much, Jane. Thank you, Jane, and everybody else. It's great to be here. I don't know if you've noticed, but Tim and I are in the same room. So you see a little bit of yellow to my shoulder, which is Tim. And we're in here with some colleagues and friends in London. Following on from Jane's comments, I think it's been a real privilege to develop the book, to edit the book with Jane and Tim. And particularly, I think for myself, developing understanding of what landscape citizenships could be. I think starting from a sort of less knowledge around citizenships and issues of belonging to landscape. And I've become particularly interested in how we can understand our agency to belong somewhere, to find place and not necessarily to be placed, the power to belong to a place without requiring that particular place to belong to me or belong to us. And then the third really is sort of, I suppose, a freedom to leave a place knowing that at some point I can return. And I think there's something quite powerful about the conversations which we've really sort of developed with the contributors and which we continue to have.
And what I have to add to that is really just to say what an incredible pleasure and an honor it's been to work with the range of contributors that we've had for the book. It's a number of emerging scholars. It's been a very kind of global conversation in many ways. And I think what the book does is it initiates a really important discussion about the nature of belonging as something that is practiced and lived and embodied, not something that comes to us as a birthright or from on high, which I think gives us important tools to think about how we deal with many of our contemporary challenges in a world that we all need to find ways to change with and to learn from it and each other.
Great, thank you both. And I think we'll begin with a few words from each of our contributors about who they are. So Danika.
Hi, I'm Danika Cooper. I'm an assistant professor at the University of California, Berkeley, as Jane mentioned. I just wanted to say maybe a few words about my chapter. So I'm talking to you from the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Chochenyo Ohlone Nation, and my chapter, which is called Legacies of Violence, really shows how intimately connected land and nationhood are, and specifically looks at the United States as an example of that. In the United States, in order to establish and maintain its land base, it's used really sophisticated citizenship policies and land laws in conjunction with one another to inflict and legalize all forms of violence, physical, spiritual, social violence against Indigenous nations. And so in the book, I'm kind of showing the ways in which that occurs, and then also arguing that in order to repair those injustices requires the kind of banal task of rewriting legal text with the ultimate goal of returning stolen lands.
Thank you. And James, will you tell us what's been on your mind in relation to the book?
First of all, thank you for welcoming me to be part of this and contribute to this very important book. The essays are incredibly important, and this book actually, I have to do a little promotion here, should be part of curriculum, absolutely, especially in landscape. Both Danika and Anna's work were quite incredible, quite profound. Talk about wonderful, very important stories that that talk about what it really means to be a citizenship, really. So, Gimi Dene Nezo in my language, which is hello everyone from Toronto. I'm not in my homelands, but I'm here in Toronto. The conversation that Jane and I had was quite incredible. We talked at length about this idea of what it really meant to be a treaty citizen, really. So I come from my worldview, my traditional teachings, and the land acts as a mediator, really, of space between the various worlds. Our concept of land it has that metaphysical sense. So we engage the land as its own entity, as it has its own spirit, and so there's a relationship building that happens with land in the way we look at land. In fact, a wonderful question I brought up for Anna. Do I ask it now or no? Okay, I'll wait. Talks about this really, in modernity, we need to almost think about these new concepts now. And I'm going to just quickly say, am I okay for time, Jane? I didn't see the hand yet. So, a few years ago, I was, am I up? Time's up? No? Okay. So a few years ago, I went to a chiefs meeting in Albuquerque, New Mexico with quite a few chiefs. There was probably, I don't know, about 30, 40 chiefs, traditional chiefs from across Native Americans and Native Canadians. This very old Navajo chief stood up, said something very profound I've never forgotten about landscape. He stood up and he said, he talked about us all identifying as being traditional land keepers or traditional landowners and being indigenous to certain parts. He stood up and he said, Mother Earth is now at a point where we have to think of all ourselves as we're all first indigenous to the planet. Nobody else is going nowhere else. And that changed how I looked or how I perceived, although we have our local areas, local areas of what we know, and we're very fond, we really know everything about our landscape in that particular area. We're at a time now where we need to think globally. And so this book just really, the essays in it just really bring to the importance of where we're at actually. And the Hopi believe, as well as the Dene, that the time we're in now is the time of the prophecy stories of the people where we're in a time where Mother Earth is about to take back her sovereignty. And so, that's an awakening for us. So it was a wonderful compilation of incredible chapters in this wonderful book. And very pleased to be part of it. Very excited. I promoted it every chance I get. So thank you. Oh, I'm also a graduate student at the School of Architecture and from the Denesoto Nation.
Thank you. Thank you, James. And Anna, will you tell us what's been on your mind in relation to the book?
Happily. So first of all, hello to everyone from Munich, Germany, where it is a beautiful snowy evening. And thank you everyone for the invitation, and thank you to the University of Toronto and Dean Du for organizing this. It's really a pleasure to get a chance to talk about the book. I came into Landscape Citizenships as a bit of an outsider, as a non-landscape architect. I was trained as a policy scholar and then entered the space of environmental humanities. And my research really works in that in-between space, trying to reconcile the ways in which we think about our connections from a humanistic perspective as societies to the landscapes in which we live in. So these questions of what the landscape means to us, what responsibility we have over it, with a little bit more pragmatic and practical questions of governance. And I came across landscape citizenship just as I was starting to think through these connections, and it's been such a generative concept for that. But I also struggled with a couple of things with the concept. I came across a couple of philosophical difficulties, shall we say, that I worked through in my chapter, just drawing on the research that I've done in the Bulgarian Black Sea coast and the Yorkshire North Sea coastline in the UK, And the two philosophical difficulties that I focused on were the questions of time and space. The question of time being essentially, I still wonder how long we need to develop landscape citizenship, to develop this connection to the land, to be able to establish that as something meaningful and something tangible in a community. And the question of space, similarly, is something that actually James has already referenced, is how far can we extend this concept? Is landscape citizenship something that is drawn from our connection to where we are, to our places, and therefore can only be a bit local, really? Or can we extend it on a global scale, given the crises that we face planetarily? And I think these are difficult things to reconcile, and it's been a pleasure to try to think through these things with this book. And I really look forward to our conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And now we'll start the kind of round robin part where I think it'll get fun, even more fun. So why don't we operate in this order? We'll have Anna ask her question of Danika, and then we'll have Danika ask her question of James, and we'll have James ask his question of Anna. Okay?
Sounds good. So Danika, I really enjoyed your chapter on so many levels, and it's been a pleasure to read it. And one of the things that it does so well, I think, is that it really gives us this very good history of how law can incorporate these historical injustices and this really kind of flawed perspective of a relationship with land. Displacing other kinds of relationship with the land, indigenous relationships with the land, and instead establishing a dominant and singular and flawed perspective on how one should relate to the space. But what I thought was also interesting in your chapter was that you give us the example of the case that helps reverse this in Oklahoma and redraw the map. And so I wondered, does landscape citizenship provide some kind of pragmatic way to think about law as restorative justice? Can it be done? Can landscape citizenship give us that perspective?
Okay, well, I mean, I think this is it's a great question. It's one that I'm struggling with a lot. And I think I struggled with in the piece itself. What are the kind of material ways in which we enact change? And I think what I realized through writing through this research of really looking to the law as primary text, as a way of understanding a society's relationship to land, a society's relationship to its population, to the environment more generally, was that I do actually think that law can be generative and restorative and be a tool for enacting reparative justice, but that requires a kind of shift in how we conceive, how a nation conceives its relationship to its people and to its land. And I think in the case of the United States, that requires a kind of acknowledgement of pluralism, right? That not all, that there isn't a kind of universal way in which to engage with land. There isn't a universal way of enacting land laws and citizenship policies. I think it's also kind of deeply imperative that we shift the kind of perception of citizenship as being something that affords rights to people and protects people against violence. And I think what I'm trying to show in this chapter is that actually in the case of the United States, citizenship is used as a tool to enact violence. And so the kind of shift in framing of what it is that the role of law is, like what is the role of law and who does it benefit? Because it's not even, it's uneven. And so thinking about restorative justice, I think requires rewriting land laws, rewriting citizenship laws to acknowledge that Indigenous nations have different ways of engaging with the land, and therefore that plural way of thinking about the environment needs to be embedded within policy. and that citizenship isn't it isn't a singular. It can be. You can be a citizen of more than one nation, and that each of those nations has its own sovereignty and ways of engaging with its own land base and its own people. So I think it's way more complicated than just re-narrating history to acknowledge this, but actually doing the work of like I said in an earlier comment, the kind of banal work of writing legal texts that are much more that acknowledge the kind of complexity and nuance of plural ways of thinking about citizenship and our engagement with the environment. Okay, so Jane, I now ask my question. Yes, okay. If for those of you who have not read the book yet, the first chapter is an amazing conversation between James and Jane and another scholar, and they're talking about belonging. And it's a fabulous way to start this conversation through the book, the kind of intellectual conversation that's happening in the book. And so I have two somewhat related questions for James. First, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about belonging and expand on this idea of land speaking that you reference in your conversation. You talk about land speaking as both an embodied practice and an architectural one. So I wonder if you can expand on that. And then building from that, I wondered if you could talk about the role of drawing. At the end of the chapter, you all decide that you're going to draw your response to the conversation. And James, you seem to posit that drawings can do something beyond what words can. And this made me wonder if drawing has the capacity to be a land language, and if so, what does it offer? How is it different from the ways in which we're practicing now?
Thank you, Danika. Your chapter was absolutely incredible. That is actually where a lot of Canadian First Nations people are right now. They're working through land agreements for self-government in Canada. So your particular chapter was quite profound, and I've sent it since then to some people in the government that found it very interesting. So language for me is the mediator between land and language. The Dene people, we believe the word Dene means people of the land. So we believe our stories, our historical stories are exactly that we come from the land, and that the land and the language comes from the land, and the language is the land. It's this relationship that we've had for hundreds and hundreds of years. What language, I think, so in my thesis, I am working on housing in reservations. And if perhaps people in Europe don't know that reservations in the United States and Canada are pretty third world. They're pretty dire. They're extremely, there are a lot of poverty. And so I'm addressing that through a thesis, looking at how I could address housing as a Native person, as a First Nations person, through language, and using language as the cue to get in to look at concept and design. And I say that because within language, there's these, in linguistics terminology, there's these little morphemes or little nuances, the little markers in language where those little parts that are untranslatable. In fact, when I speak with language, and anybody who's speaking another language knows there's certain phrases or parts or deep theoretical parts that are just untranslatable, and a lot is actually lost. So when I speak to Dene speakers, as I was doing this work, I subsequently wrote a paper a little while ago about this, how language and land, the actual name of it was using Indigenous language and ritual as starting points for concept design. So it's in those little nuances that I found it was easier to draw than to transcribe. I developed a questionnaire for the first part of my research. And instead of asking, and a lot of these people were non-English speakers, so they were traditional Dene speakers or Nehiyaw, or they were Nehiyaw and Dene Sultanate. As they would sort of answer the questionnaire, I left, instead of areas for them to write out their answers, there was a box where they could draw out their answers. It was just an easier way to find information or to talk about certain areas that you can't write, or for them, they didn't really understand the English, but they could easily draw in Dene what they meant. So there's this wonderful conversation that happened through drawings, actually. In each conversation, I created a type of watercolor language map, is what I called it. And I used watercolor because it was etherical and it didn't really, it captured some of the spirit. And from that language map, I then developed a sort of concept model. So language was integral in understanding these hidden spaces, or these otherwise hard to sort of figure out spaces that English can't go to. It's hard to, okay, for an instance, I'll give you the word Saikwan. Dene means house, but Akwa means sacred house, or house where spirit is. Behind me is a longhouse of the West Coast. And in their language, also, it's a place where it just doesn't physically house us. It brings in spirit. And so, so designing for the unseen as well as the seen. Right? So when we had this talk, and Jane actually was the one who had this brilliant idea about drawing our conversations, that really spoke to me. Spoke to me because of the like I say, the morphemes, or these accents, as the wonderful writer Jane Bennett talks about in her book Vibrant Matter, where she sort of talks about the accent. The accent is that place in between the intimate and the animate. It's this in between place that has actually agency, and so it's giving those hidden places agency, or those hidden terms agency. And I just find that fascinating, because I think that's where we need to begin to think, really. Our land, to us as the Dene people, and I only speak for myself and my people because that's all I know. I know where I'm from and the land I'm from. We believe that we're not so much citizens of the land, but the land owns us in many ways. And so, as I read through many of the chapters, I was thinking through my own worldview and own cosmology of how I think about things, this new way of sort of thinking about things. So thank you for the question, and I hope I've answered that.
Thank you. And James, what will you pose to Anna?
Yes, Anna, yours was quite the read. I took time to really read this through. I had to actually take my time to read it a couple times because there were so many interesting philosophical views. And so, the chapter talked about time and contemplating the idea of citizenship, anthropocene, and these great insights into Western philosophy, these views. The challenge is to identify the local, this local citizenship. And I liked how you used time. Time was such an incredible thing, because in the Dene worldview, time is a construct, and it's neither here nor we don't really believe in it, actually. So I found that fascinating. And I kept thinking about these new terms in modernity, the new identity to capture this changing and very, I call, diaphanous abstractions of what citizenship means. It's not really, it's moving so fast, and we live in such a global world now. So I guess the question is there even citizenship anymore? Perhaps we all are caught up in the outdated term of reference when I go back to as many people, we see this relationship with the land, that in fact we are extensions of the land. Like I was saying, that Dene word means land. And so, so we feel that the people, our land stories are ingrained in our DNA. So I guess as I was reading through your wonderfully articulated chapter, that perhaps we need to, have you thought of perhaps a new term of reference, or sort of brings up the whole idea of questions really what land citizenship means? There were some other wonderful terms in there. I can't get them offhand, but there were landship, and just the terms were very fascinating. Just had some, those were my main questions that came up. Thank you.
Thanks so much, James. Your question is so generous. There's so many aspects of it and so much to kind of bite into it that it's kind of hard to know where to start. The landship thing comes actually from Kenneth Olwick, who was the inspiration for our symposiums. That's actually his term. But the question of whether we should use a different term than citizenship, I think, is perhaps one of the core aspects of your question. And I think that's a very difficult thing to answer. And I think, yes, could be one of the answers. So citizenship, as you say, it's a bit of it's a construct in and of itself. Citizenship, the way that we understand it politically in the modern world, at least as far as I know, as far as I'm aware, is really tied to nationhood. And the nation itself is a construct, is a creation of modernity that didn't exist historically throughout time. It's a relatively new historical idea, and so to citizenship, and even so, it's not necessarily anchored to a particular view. If you look across nations, citizenship looks very different depending on where you are. If you live in a federal state, if you live in a non-federal state. So it's, perhaps we do need a new term of reference, and we do need a reference that, to go back to what Danika was saying, something that gives us a sense of the plurality of what citizenship is, which could be hard to do. And I'm fascinated with this idea of drawing our citizenship from the land and drawing our citizenship from this belonging, which I think is one of the core aspects of landscape citizenship as well, one of the core things that we consider. But then I do still wonder how that plays out in specific contexts, how that plays out with our ability to look beyond ourselves and our local area. So if I'm drawing my citizenship from where I am located, then does that not make me insular? Does that not make me ignorant of the, I live in Germany, I live in a super wealthy state. I live in a state that is responsible for relatively a high level of carbon footprint. And so if I just draw my citizenship from that land, then perhaps I'm ignoring the impact of this wealthy state on other countries, on countries that are less fortunate. And similarly, the question of drawing the citizenship from the land then asks, what do we do about migrancy and movements and these generational shifts and changes in where you're located? I myself have a kind of a nomadic background. I grew up in one country, then moved to the States, then lived in the UK, now I live in Germany. So where is my landscape citizenship? It's spread out. So what temporal aspects allow me to be a landscape citizen and allow me to draw citizenship from these spaces? I don't know, these are more questions than answers, I think, but hopefully they can open up our conversation a bit. Thanks again for your really generous question. I really appreciated it.
And I have to say, I think I can speak for Ed and Tim too here, that we're grateful to all of you for asking questions that don't really have answers, because as Tim said, this book was really meant as an invitation to wonder about things that we have too long and too often taken for granted. So it's really meant to launch a discussion without a foreseeable end. We now, and again, I speak for Tim and Ed, we invite the three of you to ask us what you'd like to know, what you've been thinking about the editorial project of a book like this.
Anna, I think you should start.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Danika, please.
I was just going to say, kind of building off of the conversation that we had earlier about landscape citizenship versus ships. I was thinking maybe Anna should start us off because it's a good way to prime the conversation.
Yes, I'm happy to do that so that I can pronounce plurality again. Right. So my question actually pertains a bit to the title of the book and also the editorial process, which, as you may have noticed, is Landscape Citizenships, plural. And as we were writing the book and discussing the book, the wonderful editors emailed us and said, so we're thinking of keeping the term plural to allow for what we've just been talking about, the plurality. Why did I ask a question about a word I find so difficult to pronounce? Of experiences. This is why we want it to be a plural term. But then the question that I have about this is, if we're recognizing the plurality of experiences, then what is in common about these different things? And how did you as editors reconcile the fact that we are gathering as a book to define something, to define a term, to define a concept, and yet at the same time we have to acknowledge that it's super different across the 14 chapters that we have. So as editors, how did you talk about that? What did you reconcile? What were your conversations behind that? That was my question.
Yeah, we can begin on our end here. Of course, the symposium was one of the places where we really began to ask those questions, and was launched from a couple of directions. One, from an insistence that forms of discussion, forms of framing that had happened during American regionalism and bioregionalism, Gary Snyder's idea of watershed citizenships, were all kind of drivers. And there's also discussions going on about ecological and environmental citizenships elsewhere in the legal scholarship. However, what Kenneth Olwig did very usefully in his book, The Meanings of Landscapes, was to say that the suffix scape describes both shape, which is important because landscape has form, and also to speak about ship, as in relationship, fellowship, partnership, stewardship, that it describes a relationship between people and place, and between people and people in place, and of course with other species. So the question, I think, then naturally extended to how do we bring this term into the emerging dialogues about the right to landscape, about landscape justice and landscape democracy, again, which talk about the notion of landscape as a dialogic and practiced and embodied realm, all of which supports the underpinnings for the discussions that we're having now. And in terms of the plural, and I'll let the rest of you go in just a moment, in terms of the plural, it's because landscapes are multiscalar, because they're nested into one another. Our belongings are not merely to one landscape, and sometimes they're imported in. It's because landscapes are distinct, so that's why they're plural, and also because many citizenships can be found in one place, many forms of belonging. And so the important thing that the concept insists upon is the notion, and this touches usefully on James's discussion, that language is key, that translation then becomes core to the practice of citizenship, or the practices of citizenships.
Great. It's a great question and a great answer. And I think what I'm going to suggest is just so that we can have as many questions as possible from these three and from the audience, that we move on, and that the three of us editors take turns answering as well. Is that amenable to everybody? Is everybody amenable to that? I'm backwards. So whose question next?
Well, I think Tim answered part of it, and it was how did this book become? I mean, what was the driving factor? And I think this came out of a conference, right? Is that right? Because it's so brilliant, and it's such an important, it's so poignant in the time we're in right now. You know, they give this to the EU leaders, or there's some very valuable information here that can drive policy in real powerful ways. And so, yeah, I was more interested in how this happened, but also the questions about the citizenships, the language, the labeling of the book, and you've answered part of that. But so this did come out of a conference then. Okay.
Yeah, and I was going to say, why don't we give that one to Ed, if you're okay with that, Ed?
Thank you very much, Jane. So if I can think back far enough to the symposium and the conversations we had at the beginning, I mean, I think Jane and Tim and I have worked together before, and I think that we are quite keen to find an excuse to work together. So very practically, we need to think of a plan or an idea or a series of questions that would excite us. And if I remember rightly, I'm pretty sure it was Tim who prodded me and said, how about we do something around citizenships, and how about we get Jane involved? And really the symposium came from, I suppose, just some very open-ended questions that we were interested in asking. And I think Jane mentioned it already, that sort of our, I suppose, our enthusiasm for engaging with things that we don't understand, we don't have an awful lot of knowledge about, was really a great starting point, because actually bringing together people from a range of fields for the symposium back in, I think it's 2019 here in London, it really meant that, at least for myself, you know, I've been learning constantly since then, you know, from people like yourself, from Anna, from Danika. And I think that this is the second event we've had around the book, and I just continue to be fascinated by the sort of conversations that are coming out. And I think that I for myself have kind of sidestepped the term citizenships in the chapter I wrote, and I think in many of the conversations, and leaning a lot more on belonging. And I think there's something very interesting about sort of the way in which each of us are picking up different threads through the conversation. And I think I appreciate Danika's sort of, let's say, her challenge to be more critical of citizenships rather than just sidestepping it. And I think that sort of maybe that's the next step, is when we grab hold of someone and say, actually, there's some real problems here.
Yeah, great. And we'll give Danika a turn, and maybe I'll take that one, and then we'll start with a more open conversation.
Well, I'll be quick because I know we're running out of time. I just wanted to maybe bring it back to the discipline and ask what opportunities arise from thinking about landscape citizenships as a lens through which to look at practice. How does the discipline change or adjust or expand when we incorporate this term and all of its complexity and pluralities into the discipline and the discourse of practice?
Yeah, and I'll answer that one because it's something I've been thinking about for a long time. Landscapes are complicated, and they're multi-scalar, and they exist across long periods of time. They mean different things to different people. And it seems to me that that complexity is actually an invitation for the discipline to understand itself in different ways. So site design, excellent design at the scale of one site, one parcel, one neighborhood, one region is really important. And that material practice, I don't think should ever go away from landscape architecture. And at the same time, I think if as landscape architects, we can find ways to engage larger questions and larger publics, we will expand the agency of our discipline and the agency of design more broadly. So something that I have thought about a lot, and I know Ed and Tim have thought about too, is what if we imagined ourselves as designers of conversations, not only as designers of particular pieces of the surface of the earth? We'll open it up now to the audience, and we'll give the first question to Dean Du, who has kindly said that she's got something on her mind. So Joanne,
Sure.
please.
Thanks, Jane. First, I just want to congratulate everyone, the editors and the contributors, for a wonderful collection of provocative essays and thoughts. You know, this discussion of whether the terminology of citizenship is the right one fascinates me. I did have a Freudian slip earlier when I entered this book as landscape citizens. Part of it is I feel like citizenship is given. Somehow you're asking someone else to grant you, but citizens is you take it. Like every individual is a citizen to the place with whom they identify that they belong to, whether it's a place they live or a place they're from or a place they love. So for me, that is one of the underlying I think overlooked agency when we discuss landscape democracy and landscape justice, is that very often we're seeking others to give us that justice. We're seeking others to grant the democracy. So for something that I find that's really interesting is to really think about how does individuals act as citizens and how does individuals contribute to that notion of democracy and justice. So with that, I would like to ask, what I find what's interesting about the book, in addition to what I just said, is that it is a collection of different cases in North America, in Europe, and in the Middle East. And I could easily imagine a part 2 to this book that expand to other regions in the world. So I do find that it's really interesting to be able to have somewhat of a global view, if you will, to these very localized issues, right, that are down to a century of history of a particular community. So I find this balance between a global perspective and local specificity to be really fascinating. And I personally think it's the key to, I think, where we should move in larger discussions, such as under our current environmental crisis and social one. I believe the climate change is both an environmental and a social crisis. So I would like to ask, and this is either to the editors or any of the contributors, that in search of new directions for global actions in looking at examining our environmental crisis, how has these investigations of individual local specificities shed new light on what should be happening and what should be in discussion? I'm thinking of the recent global environmental summit, these still very metric-based and very much top-down and abstract goals of cutting methane and cutting carbon, which is not to say that's not important, it is. But I find that what's missing are really specificities that can really allow citizens to act. So I would be very interested to hear, having had a few years after the conference and now you produced this book, how does this volume contribute or counter that conventional thinking of the scale it takes to address climate change?
Can I jump in on that one? And I think that there's a very important framing or set of framings, and this speaks directly to the notion of a conversation, is that if we think of democracy and equality and citizenships as something that are given or claimed, then they assume a kind of monolithic character. And they become, as Danika's work has shown, they become weapons. They become ways of furthering the oppression of people in specific places. But if we see equality, democracy, citizenships as practiced, as verified, as things that are mutually assured, that we give one another and that we negotiate in a conversation with the places that we inhabit. And again, I think to understand that those relationships are also multi-scalar, that those relationships happen at different scales and in different ways, and they move, following Anna's work, on different timescales as well. So I think that's really the beginning point, is that we've got to stop thinking in absolutes and start thinking in motion.
Jane, do you mind if I carry on with this to respond to this? And Tim, maybe he doesn't mind if I slightly contradict him as well.
I don't mind at all.
As I often do. I'm going to say, I agree with everything Tim said, but I do think there's also a place for fighting over rights and struggling for citizenship and also claiming it. And I think that actually there is a, there are too many people who are denied rights, particularly to belong to places that we need to recognize. And I think that those often don't come without a struggle. So I think that there are many different ways. I think Danika said earlier, there's no singular or universal way of relating to the land. And I think actually the struggle is a key way.
Jane, can I just quickly say something? Thank you, everybody. Is that, has anybody ever consulted the land? It was a question that I asked actually an elder, somebody who negotiates land treaties. And he said, the question has to be asked to the land. And as abstract as that may seem, it's true. The land is a spirit of its own. So they do ceremony in Australia, actually, with the land. Douglas Cardinal does it when he builds a building. He'll go sleep on the land. He'll literally set up where he's about to build a building. He'll build this relationship over a couple of nights of sleeping, camping on it with a tent on the piece of land that he's about to build on. And he literally has this conversation. I think the land right now, globally I'm talking, not just locally, is screaming at us. And we need to find the ears to listen. Or as the prophecy says, Mother Earth is going to she is taking back her sovereignty. That's our prophecy story. So it's thinking outside, right? Outside what we conceive as land and landship. It's asking the very thing we're talking about. It came up actually. I was sharing the reading with a wonderful elder that I really respect, who has spent his whole life in land claims. Anyway, that's just my thought.
How about Danika and Anna? Would either of you like to take a crack at this one?
Yes, potentially. It's a very good question. And the discussion we've been having since the beginning, since the end of the question, has also been very multifaceted. I was thinking about the individual agency aspect of this, which Dean Du also pointed out too. And I think often that absolutely individuals have immense agency in negotiating their citizenship and in negotiating their space within the land. And often enough, they actually have a lot more creativity and a lot more robust perspective on what it means to be a citizen of the land than scholars do. Because it's a lived experience, it's a lived and negotiated experience. And citizenship, when it works, should be negotiated. It should be a lived process that is fought for and continuously negotiated and continuously represented and reshaped and renegotiated. And I think the individual agency is incredibly important for this. And including with COP, there's been many examples of individuals who have participated and who have made a big splash. Many great activists who have presented an individual perspective on how citizenship can be negotiated on a global as well as on a local scale.
Jane, maybe we take one audience question. Unless there aren't any audience questions.
Forgive me, I have been trying to mine the chat and I haven't seen audience questions, but am I missing them?
Oh, it looks like.
No, I think there's no audience questions. So I'm speaking on behalf of the audience.
Okay.
So our audience is, I know, very up to here with the end of the term. And so that's why I think we've got this wonderfully broad question from Juan. We have about 3 minutes left before we have to begin our goodbyes. And so if you feel like it, Danika, you're welcome.
It seems like maybe in Tim and Ed's room, there's a question. Is that right?
Oh, forgive me.
Yeah. We have a couple of questions. Could we take both of them in quick succession? Diana.
What could be the relationship between citizenship and stewardship, landscape stewardship?
Okay, so that question is, what can be the relationship between citizenship and stewardship? Great question. And Christoph.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation and conversation. I'll try to be quick. It's very difficult for me. So I was wondering about the context of citizenship in relation to citizenship as a weapon, citizenship as a tool, and I think maybe also this idea of plural citizenship, shared citizenship, and it seems to me like ownership is a term that could be substituted in all of those contexts, being it a tool of violence, and maybe a more difficult topic to reconcile with citizenship in terms of the idea of plurality, and maybe also in terms of the idea of returning citizenship to the owners. Is that returning the land to the owners, or is it returning the land to a different form of ownership? So I was wondering about this relationship.
I could jump right in there.
Did anyone hear it?
Yeah, did everyone hear that question? Or
Yeah, I think I'm going to give you a hard assignment because we really only have 2 minutes. Can you very concisely repeat the question and then maybe give us like a one sentence thought?
Maybe Tim can help to rephrase the question just for the sake of the audience online. It's a little bit difficult to hear.
I think that the question, and maybe I'll go right to the core of it, is the idea of ownership. And of course, that also is speaking about notions of belonging as well, to speak about owning. I think the really interesting thing, and to kind of try to round these questions up quickly, is to just alert you to the fact that we've got the idea of citizenship, we've got the idea of stewardship, and the idea of ownership. And if we take any of those apart and think about the idea of ownership maybe as also being a conversation rather than something that's written down on a piece of paper and is there for time immemorial, and also to think of stewardship as not as something we do to or at, but as stewardship as something that is thoroughly embedded in a set of landscape processes or landships.
Thank you. And I think I'll just add a tiny thing that comes from what James said to us about how it's the land actually that is the first spirit among us. And also I'll go back to the idea of being a treaty person and pose the question that ownership assumes rights, but I think what we have to understand about ourselves as treaty people is that we have responsibilities to each other and to the places where we have the good fortune to be. So with that, we're right at 1 o'clock. I'll say Masi Cho, Chi Miigwech, thank you kindly to Ed, Tim, Anna, James, Danika, and Juan, and to all of you whom I can't see for joining us this afternoon. This is the last event in the fall programming series. So thank you to everyone who's been joining us online, occasionally even in person. And don't forget that the 2022 Winter Public Programming Series will begin with another book talk Forest for the Trees, The Tree Planters by Rita Leister. It's online Tuesday, January 18th at noon Eastern Time. So see you then. And until then, keep well. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.